Welcome to the Panzermuseum Munster. Today we look at the schwere Panzerspähwagen, the Sonderkraftfahrzeug 234/1, 2, 3 and 4. So the 20mm with 50mm, 75mm short and 75mm long like we have here. Now this is more or less official designation. As usual with German vehicles there were various designations, but keep in mind, although this order is nice and neat, this was not the order they were originally produced in. So there's a bit, so the /1 is not the first one, although it is the foundational vehicle, interestingly enough. So let's look at the development. Now, the Germans were very happy with their 8-wheel armored recon vehicles so far, but they noticed, okay, the cross-country mobility is not the best. So there's a major difference. This one actually has an armored hull from the get-go. The other one has basically a chassis where the armored superstructure was put on top. So in 1940 they issue a new contract, and originally this is called basically a colonial, a tropical vehicle. So also major difference, this one has an air-cooled engine, an air-cooled diesel engine. And this is one of the very first armored vehicles the Germans used with a diesel engine. Now, it's not that way that the Germans didn't use diesel at all. They had various other vehicles, but they were non-armored that they used diesels within. So it was not an issue that there was no diesel in the Panzer or general German units available. Now, in terms of specifications, they wanted to have basically protection against small arms fire mainly. So you have 30mm face-hardened armor. You have a crew of 4 men. Here, very important, you have 2 drivers, one facing front and one facing backwards. And they both have the steering wheel, which you can see later. June 1942, the testing vehicle was ready. Driving tests were conducted. Major problems with the diesel engine. Then in July 1942, the request for a 50mm gun plus an MG42 in the turret was done. The engine's problems were mostly fixed, and the first series production hulls were delivered in May 1943. Yet in total, in 1943, only 3 of these vehicles were delivered to the troops, and those were those with the 50mm gun. Now it's time to talk about the variants. As mentioned before, the terminology Sonderkraftfahrzeug 234/1, 2, 234/4 was already used during the war. The base variant was the 234/1 with the 20mm autocannon, but it was only produced from 44 to 45. Meanwhile, the 234/2 with the 50mm gun was already produced in 1943, although only 3 of them were delivered, and in total only 101 were built from 43 to 44. So basically all of them were produced in 44 except 3. Now the 234/3 with the short 75mm gun, which had no turret, was only produced in 44 with 88. And this version we are right on top here, the 234/4 with the Pak 40 mounted on top with no turret, was produced in 44 to 45, and about 70 were produced. Now a major difference to the other variants was that the main fuel tank with 110 liters was missing. It just had 2 70-liter tanks like the others. And overall the combat weight was around 11.5 to 12 metric tons. So let's take a look here. So we have here face-hardened 30mm armor. Here we have the vision port of the driver. We have the Pak 40 mounted on top. Now, originally it was planned to have a turret with a dedicated gun, but the gun mount and everything was not ready in time, and they decided, okay, we just put the Pak 40 in there because we need this vehicle rather early. You have 8 wheels, all of them are steered. And then you can see where basically the part was mounted on top, welded on top for protecting the gun crew. And if we come back here to the rear, and here on the rear you can see here is the vision port for the rear driver, and here's the wheel inside, which I'll show you later. And over here at the back there would usually be a spare wheel mounted here, which is missing in this case. Here we have the Pak 40 mounted. here, this seems to be a carrier for signal ammunition. And here this mount looks very familiar. There's usually have something similar at the back of a 251, and this was basically to mount the MG42 with. So you had also your machine gun here with your gun. The driver is at the front. And here you can see the steering wheel of the rear driver. Now, sadly here the seating and everything is missing, but yeah, this would be how it was basically arranged. That you had here your driver, your second driver, and here you had the gunner and the loader basically.
Correction here, the top and rear position viewport for the second driver is actually not historically accurate from what I know. This resembles the setup of the Sonderkraftfahrzeug 234/3 with the short 75mm gun. Due to the size of the Pak 40 in the front, most of the top had to be removed, and at the rear, the second driver's vision port was also removed. Here you can see in War Thunder how it was done in real life, at least according to the info I have from my sources. Sadly, I don't know why this is the case. I guess that this Sonderkraftfahrzeug in the museum was restored with scavenged parts from other variants. If you enjoyed deep research and insights on military history, check out our publishing house Military History Group. Currently, you can pick up all our books with up to 20% discount and a special 25% discount on our newest German book, The Mythos Stuka, written by my colleagues Dr. Roman Töppel, Dr. Jens Wehner and Christoph Bergs from Military Aviation History. It is the first book that completely tackles the prevailing popular memory of the Junkers 87, Stuka, and provides new information in detail on accuracy, the famous siren, planes, track and air combat, and kill claims by Hans-Ulrich Rudel. If you're more into ground combat, the discount includes our other titles that deal mostly with tanks, but also infantry tactics as well. Make sure you get yourself or a friend a copy until the 27th of October when the sale ends. Now let's look at mobility next.
The engine had a max speed of 80 kilometers per hour, which is 50 miles per hour, 220 horsepower at 2,250 revolutions per minute, and it used 35 liters at 100 kilometers, that's 9.24 gallons at 62 miles. The gearbox shifted by two separate switchgear assemblies, one for each driver, forward and back.
The drive axles were constructed as independent axles and had bevel gear drives which had self-locking differential gears from the company Rheinmetall to compensate different wheel speeds while driving through curves. The axle housings with the drive units were located inside of the armored hull. In addition, the intermediate gear drive axles had self-locking intermediate gear differentials which compensated for the different speeds between the wheels of the intermediate gear drive axles and other drive axles while driving cross-country or through curves. The other drive axles did not have such intermediate gear differentials. The propulsion of these outer axles affected directly on the bevel gear drive. The transmission of the driving power from the bevel gear drives to the wheels was ensured by drive shafts, each of which had two cardan joints. The cardan joints compensated for changes of angle caused by steering the wheels or when the axles swung off.
Now let's talk about firepower shortly. Now this is a Pak 40, so we have the similar values, which I'll show you later. Overall, you had an elevation from -5 degrees to +22, and you have a traverse to 20 degrees to each side, which is actually, considering how this is mounted, quite a lot, because this is definitely more you have in a Jagdpanzer 4 or in a Jagdpanzer 38, generally called the Hetzer. Now, of course, you are quite exposed here, particularly against on the top, but overall, it's probably a rather better situation than being in a Pak 40, but at the time of the war, because the main issue with the Pak 40 was its limited mobility, and they were generally engaged by artillery or could not move out of the way and were often overrun before they could fire a single shot at an enemy tank, as stated in various reports from 44 and 45.
A look at penetration values for the regular armor-piercing projectile Panzergranate 39 and also the armor-piercing composite rigid projectile Panzergranate 40. Note that these values are for an impact angle of 30 degrees. Be aware that I found several different values and these are not from primary sources. I found only a value for 1000 meter in a primary source and it was lower than that from the secondary source. As such, take these values with a grain of salt. At a range of 100 meter, the penetration is about 106 mm with the AP shell and 143 mm with the APCR shell. At 500 meters, these values drop to 96 and 120, and at a range of 1000, the values are 85 and 97 mm, whereas the primary source gives 80 and 85 mm. To put this in perspective, the effective armor thickness of the upper hull of a KV-1S was 76 mm. The Cromwell had 64 mm, the M4A3 Sherman had 72 mm, the T-34/85 had 90 mm, and the Panzer IV Ausführung H had 81 mm, according to Zaloga. So if these numbers are correct, at 500 meter the gun could penetrate the upper frontal hull of the various medium tanks with a regular AP shell, and even at 1000 meters this was the case with the exception of the T-34/85.
Now about armor protection, everything was at least armored with 5.5 millimeter armor plate. So this protected against small arms ammunition. The frontal plate was basically 30 millimeter face hardened armor. So this was safe against a 30 millimeter puck at this point, more or less. So light anti-tank weapons, it protected against, of course, keep in mind, these were rarely deployed at this late in the war, in 44, 45, and this vehicle was mainly used. So some specifics here, the 37 millimeter puck could penetrate 35 millimeters at 100 meters, but keep in mind we had a sloped armor here, which meant it would be safe at this distance. Now the upper front plate was at 50 millimeter at 70 degrees, the upper and lower hull sides were 8 millimeter, the roof and engine compartment 5.5 millimeter, and the rear 10 millimeter. Now let's talk about organization next. Now this vehicle was generally only issued to Panzer divisions and unicorn divisions like the Panzergrenadier Division Großdeutschland, not to regular Panzergrenadier divisions.
So let us look at two examples here, namely the Panzerspähwagen Company A from 1943. It had 25 Sonderkraftfahrzeug 234/2, so with the 50 mm gun, one in the headquarters section, and then 4 platoons with 6 each. Notice that every second had a star antenna with long-range radio.
In 1945,
there was a mixed recon company introduced. It looked quite different. There was still one Sonderkraftfahrzeug 234 in the headquarters section, but it was armed with a 20 mm autocannon. The number of platoons was reduced to 3. The first platoon consists of 4 squads, each consisting of one Sonderkraftfahrzeug 234 with a 20 mm autocannon and a star antenna, and one Sonderkraftfahrzeug 234 with a Pak 40. The second platoon was like the first platoon, only with 1 squad less. The third platoon was widely different and consists of 3 squads with 3 vehicles each. Those were 251 half-tracks. Each squad had 1 radio variant, one with a triple 20 mm gun, and one with a 75 mm Pak 40. So in total 24 vehicles, which is only 1 vehicle less, but with a more diverse setup, namely 2 different chassis and 2 different types of gun, 20 mm and 75 mm.
Now we have a few experience reports. In general, they are very positive. There were some issues with the engines, leaky welds, like in a few cases the turret was stuck on the hull and they had to shave off some things. Then there were some problems with the bakelite, which is basically a kind of plastic that broke on the gun grip or something, and they replaced it with wood. In one case they were issued civilian tires, and overall mainly minor issues, no big issues. Then there was also one report of somebody being engaged by US fighter bombers with strafing attacks, and it's very interesting. He complained that the 50 mm gun is a problem in this case because there was no chance to defend, so that you generally should at least have 1 vehicle with a 20 mm gun to defend against such attacks. But he particularly noted, although he was strafed several times, that the armor was never pierced, which is also quite interesting. If it were really 50 cals and they couldn't penetrate the armor because it was not that strong at the various points. To summarize, in overall the 234 series was a effective and successful vehicle. It was the eyes of the Panzerwaffe from 44 to 45. Now it also had a great range, of course. With this type of vehicle, the range was traded for better firepower against tanks. Now what is interesting, this vehicle is quite popular, but at the same time it was a very rare vehicle. About 480 were produced. If you keep this in mind, of the Tiger 1, 1,350 were produced. So less than 500 were produced. This is similar, very low to the production numbers of the King Tiger. So a bit more King Tigers were likely produced than this vehicle, while this is still very well known. Big thank you to the Panzermuseum Munster for inviting me. Thank you to my supporters on Patreon and Subscribestar. Thank you to Andy and Tobias for supporting me on site. Thank you for watching and see you next time.